100. That is the number that just turned a slow-burning crisis into a grim and unmistakable milestone. 100 commercial ships, caught up in the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, the world's most important waterway. As a war that has raged for 3 months drags toward an uncertain end. The American blockade has now hit what the reporters are calling the century mark. 100 vessels swept into the standoff over the narrow channel through which a fifth of the world's oil must pass. And here is what makes that number so haunting. It comes at the moment the president has announced that a peace deal is largely negotiated, that the strait is about to reopen. So how can the blockade be hitting a grim new milestone at the same time the world is being told peace is at hand? The answer is that the deal is wobbling, and the gap between the announcement of peace and the reality on the water is enormous. Those 100 ships are the truest measure of where this conflict actually stands. In this video, I'm going to take you behind that number to the human beings and the cargo caught in the grip of the blockade. To explain what a blockade of the world's most vital strait actually means, and why those 100 ships tell you the real story. Because while the leaders talk of peace, the ships are still stuck, and the ships do not lie. Let me ground this in what the milestone actually is. The number carries a weight that deserves to be understood precisely. As the war between the United States, Israel, and Iran has ground on, the Strait of Hormuz has become the central battleground, not of bombs and missiles, but of ships and blockades. When Iran moved to choke the strait, the United States responded with a blockade of its own, a naval cordon. The Strait of Hormuz is the single most important oil transit choke point on Earth. Disruption here is not a local inconvenience, it is a wound in the circulatory system of the global economy. Each ship represents cargo not reaching its destination, and crews caught in a standoff far above their pay grade. But before we talk about economics, let us talk about the human beings. Behind that number are thousands of people, ordinary working people, often from poorer nations, who now find themselves caught in the middle of a war between great powers. These are people far from home, uncertain whether and when they will be able to complete their voyages and return to their families. The life of a seafarer is hard enough in normal times, long months at sea in isolation. To be caught in a blockade in a war zone adds a layer of fear and uncertainty that most of us can scarcely imagine. These crews did not choose this war. They have no stake in the disputes, and yet they are among the most directly affected. The 100 ships are not just hulls and cargo, they are floating communities of human beings caught in the gears of a geopolitical machine. Picture a narrow channel at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, narrow enough at points that it spans only a couple of dozen miles. Through that thin ribbon of sea passes close to a fifth of all the oil consumed by the entire human race every single day. Roughly 20 million barrels of crude and refined product squeezed through a gap you could cross in a fast boat in an afternoon. There is no real alternative route. There is no spare pipeline that can swallow that volume. When people call Hormuz a choke point, they are understating it. It is the single most important valve in the global economy. It is why oil markets convulse at the threat to the strait, and why the entire world has been on edge for 3 months. The 100 trapped ships are stuck in the most strategically important waterway on the planet. Their predicament is a direct expression of the fact that the world's most vital choke point has become a battlefield, dangerous and far from free. Let me take you back through how the strait became a battlefield, because the road to this milestone is the road of the entire war. The conflict began at the end of February, when the United States and Israel launched sweeping strikes against Iran. The aims reached to dismantling Iran's nuclear programs and even, in some framings, to toppling the regime. In their opening hours, the strikes reached the very top of the Iranian state, killing the longtime supreme leader. Iran did not collapse. It installed the fallen leader's son as his successor and struck back, firing missiles and drones across the region. It reached for its most powerful weapon by moving to choke the Strait of Hormuz, halting the normal flow of traffic. The effect was immediate and global, with oil prices skyrocketing and fears of inflation spreading around the world. The United States responded with a blockade of its own, a naval cordon aimed at strangling Iran's economy. Pressure for pressure, squeeze for squeeze. The strait became the central front, a place where the two sides waged an economic struggle. The ceasefire that eventually took hold was meant to ease this, but it has been fragile and repeatedly violated. The blockade has persisted, accumulating trapped ships that have now reached the grim milestone of 100. A blockade is one of the oldest weapons of war, and understanding how it works illuminates why it is so effective and so cruel. By controlling access to a vital waterway, you can strangle an enemy's economy without ever launching a direct attack. A blockade is a form of siege, extended to the sea, a way of inflicting enormous pain through pressure rather than through bombs. Iran moved to choke the Strait of Hormuz, threatening the oil exports of the entire region and the world. The United States blockaded to squeeze Iran in return, affecting the commercial shipping in the contested waters. The result is a waterway caught in a vice, with traffic disrupted from multiple directions, the normal commerce of the strait paralyzed. The genius and the horror of a blockade is that it works slowly, grinding down the enemy over time, accumulating pressure and pain. The 100-ship milestone is a marker of how long the strait has been choked. Each ship is another increment of disruption. The blockade is patient and relentless, and 100 ships is what its patience and relentlessness look like in practice. There have effectively been 2 blockades operating at once, layered on top of each other, which is why the situation became so paralyzed. Iran used its control of the narrow waterway to strangle oil exports. The second was the American blockade aimed at squeezing Iran. The U.S. attempted to break the paralysis by having its Navy escort commercial vessels, only to pause those operations amid shifting diplomacy. The result of these overlapping blockades and escorts was a waterway in chaos, where the normal rules of free passage had broken down. Ships moved or did not move, depending on the latest state of a conflict they could not control. The 100 ships are caught in a zone where 2 hostile powers are exerting opposing pressures on the same waters. Lifting the paralysis requires not just one side to stand down, but both, requiring the unwinding of a mutual strangulation. This mutual quality is why the trapped ships cannot simply be freed by one side's goodwill, because each blockade is tied to the other. Iran will not relinquish control until its demands are met. Each side waits for the other to move first. The 100 ships are caught in the resulting deadlock, hostages to a standoff where neither side will relax its pressure. The freeing of the ships depends on the resolution of the dispute over who controls the strait, a de-escalation that has proven elusive. The 100 ships will move when both blockades lift together and not before. That requires a level of trust and coordination between bitter enemies that the wobbling deal has not yet delivered. The plight of the seafarers points to a whole dimension of this crisis that rarely makes the headlines, the vast and intricate world of global shipping that the blockade has thrown into disarray. Modern commerce depends on an enormous, largely invisible system of ships and crews and insurers and shippers, moving goods and oil across the world's oceans with a reliability that the rest of us take for granted. When a vital waterway like Hormuz becomes a war zone, that system seizes up in ways that ripple outward. The cost of insuring a ship against war risk, of covering a vessel that must pass through or near a contested strait, climbs steeply. And that added cost is passed along into the price of everything the ship carries. Shipping companies may reroute their vessels around the threatened waters, adding days and expense to voyages, or may simply refuse to send their ships into the danger zone at all, choking off the flow of goods. The rates charged for shipping rise, the schedules are disrupted, the carefully calibrated logistics of global trade are thrown off balance. And the crews, the seafarers on the trapped and delayed vessels, bear the brunt of it, their contracts extended, their voyages prolonged, their lives suspended in the uncertainty of a standoff. The 100 trapped ships are the visible tip of a much larger disruption to the global shipping system, a disruption whose costs are diffused through the entire economy in the form of higher prices and strained supply chains. There is also a dimension of international law woven through all of this, because blockades are governed by legal principles. Iran has argued that the American blockade of its ports is contrary to international law, a violation of the freedom of navigation. The United States frames its actions as a justified response to Iran's own closure of the strait. These competing legal claims are part of the larger struggle, each side seeking to portray its own actions as legitimate. The principle of the freedom of the seas is one of the foundations of the global order, and the blockade and the closure together represent a profound disruption of that principle, a breakdown of the rules. The 100 trapped vessels are casualties of that breakdown, caught where the normal legal protections have given way. The restoration of that freedom, the reopening of the strait to lawful commerce, is precisely what is at stake. And the economic consequences of all this radiate far beyond the strait, reaching into the life of nearly every person. When the flow of oil through Hormuz is disrupted, the price of oil rises, and the price of oil touches everything. Higher oil prices mean higher fuel costs, driving up the price of food and goods, leading to inflation. The disruption helped push inflation to its highest level in years, a direct line from the Persian Gulf to households. When a ceasefire was briefly agreed, the markets reacted with euphoria, oil prices plunging and stock markets jumping. The 100 trapped ships are a symbol of the economic chokehold on the global economy. The moment the strait was choked, oil prices skyrocketed, and that surge rippled outward into transport costs. Oil-producing nations tried to compensate, agreeing to raise output to stabilize global markets. All of this reveals the strait as a kind of master switch for the global economy. A single point of leverage whose status can send markets swinging wildly in either direction. Until the blockade lifts and the ships move, the master switch stays flipped toward disruption. The world keeps paying the price. The 100 ships remain an economic alarm bell, a marker of global cost. This sensitivity means that the wobbling of the deal has immediate economic effects, because every shift in resolution moves the markets and prices people pay. When the president announced a deal was negotiated and the strait would reopen, that announcement would have been expected to ease prices and calm markets. But when Iran disputed the announcement and the blockade hit its grim milestone, the optimism was undercut and uncertainty reasserted itself. The economic relief that a genuine deal would bring remained out of reach. The gap between announced peace and trapped ships is an economic matter. The markets respond not to announcements, but to reality. The reality of 100 trapped ships tells markets that the crisis is not over. Trapped ships are a signal that the disruption persists, that relief has not come, and the master switch remains flipped toward pain. This signal keeps prices elevated and uncertainty high until the concrete reality changes and the ships finally move. There's a particular cruelty in this economic pain because the heaviest burden often falls on those least able to bear it. When energy and food prices rise, it is the poor in nations far from the Persian Gulf who suffer most. They spend the largest share of their income on necessities that a strait crisis makes more expensive. A war over the strait reaches across the world to make life harder for people who have no stake in the rivalry. They simply find that the cost of feeding their families and fueling their lives has risen because of a distant conflict. This is the hidden human cost, the vast suffering of ordinary people who absorb the economic shockwaves of a crisis they did not create. The 100 ships are a visible symbol of a much larger toll, the global redistribution of pain that a choke point crisis inevitably produces. It is one more reason the world wants this war to end, the blockade to lift, and the strait to reopen. Every day of disruption is another day of pain spread across the globe, falling hardest on those who can least afford it. This grim milestone arrived at the very moment peace was being announced, and that juxtaposition is the heart of the matter. The American president declared that a peace deal had been largely negotiated and that the details would be announced shortly. This was the promise that the strait would reopen, the blockade would lift, and the economic pain would ease. Yet, at almost the same moment, the blockade hit its 100-ship milestone, a stark reminder that announcement and reality had not yet converged. How can both things be true? The answer is that the deal is wobbling, far less certain than the triumphant framing suggested. Iran disputed the announcement, calling it inconsistent with reality and insisting that the strait would remain under their management. So the deal is contested, its terms disputed, its future uncertain. As long as the deal wobbles, the blockade persists, and ships stay trapped. The 100-ship milestone is a direct measure of the gap between the announced peace and the actual reality. These ships cut through the spin and reveal the truth. Announcements can be spun, but the ship's predicament is concrete. The fact that 100 remain caught tells you the conflict is not yet resolved. If the deal were done, they would be moving. The trapping of the 100th ship is the reality testing the announcement and finding it wanting, the concrete fact contradicting optimistic words. When the president says the strait is reopening while ships are hitting a grim milestone, the ships are the more reliable witness. They reflect what is actually happening in the water rather than what is being claimed in the announcements. Ships anchor the analysis in reality. They remind us that peace is not what is announced, but what actually happens. Until the ships move, the peace is not real, no matter what anyone declares. At the center of why the ships remain trapped is the fundamental dispute over the strait itself, the contradiction between the two sides over who controls it. And this dispute is precisely what must be resolved before the blockade can lift. The president announced that the strait was reopening. Iran insisted it remains under Iranian management. In the days before the announcement, Iran had created a new body, a Persian Gulf Strait Authority. They declared a controlled maritime zone over the strait, an attempt to institutionalize its control over the waterway. Iranian state media claimed that dozens of vessels had transited the strait in coordination with Iran's naval forces, framing passage as something that happens under Iranian management and permission rather than as free navigation. Meanwhile, the American position demanded the reopening of the strait without tolls, a restoration of free and open passage as it existed before the war. So the two visions remain fundamentally opposed. Iran envisions a strait that it manages, where ships pass with its permission. The United States envisions a strait restored to a free global commons, untaxed and unmanaged by any single power. And the blockade, the trapping of the 100 ships, is bound up with this dispute because the United States will not lift its pressure until the strait is genuinely reopened on its terms, and Iran will not relinquish its control until it is satisfied its demands are met. The 100 ships are trapped in the gap between these two visions, hostages to a dispute over who controls the world's most important waterway. To grasp how hard this dispute is to resolve, consider how concrete and how symbolic Iran's bid for control has become. In Tehran, a billboard reportedly proclaimed the strait to be forever in Iran's hand, a public declaration of permanent control. Iran's creation of a Persian Gulf Strait Authority and its declaration of a controlled maritime zone were institutional steps, the machinery of a state, asserting governance over the waterway, establishing that passage happens by Iran's permission and under its management. Earlier in the war, the American president had even floated the idea of a joint venture with Iran to secure the strait, a notion that itself implied some shared arrangement rather than a simple restoration of free navigation, hinting at how murky the question has become. So the dispute is not merely rhetorical, it is being built into institutions and infrastructure and public symbols, and the demand for reopening without tolls goes to the heart of it, because a strait where Iran charges for passage is not free. The 100 trapped ships are caught precisely in this gap, because the question of who won the struggle over the strait has not been answered. To genuinely reopen the strait to free navigation would require Iran to dismantle the apparatus of control it has built, to abandon its claim to manage the waterway, to allow ships to pass without permission or coordination or payment in a verifiable way. To merely allow some ships to pass under Iranian management would be something far short of true reopening, a continuation of Iranian control. The difference between these two outcomes is the difference between the president's version of the deal and Iran's version. It is a difference that cannot be papered over, because it will become concrete every time a ship attempts to pass. The 100 trapped ships are waiting on the resolution of exactly this question, and their fate will be the clearest possible evidence. The blockade is not only an economic weapon, it is also a dangerous flashpoint, a place where the war could suddenly escalate. Throughout the conflict, the strait has been the scene of confrontations at sea, with Iran's forces seizing commercial vessels. A blockade brings warships and commercial vessels and the forces of hostile powers into close, intense proximity. In such conditions, a single miscalculation, a single misread maneuver, or a single incident at sea could ignite a broader confrontation. The 100 trapped ships are not in a safe harbor. They are in a contested, militarized waterway where the danger of escalation is ever present. A clash between the blockading forces and Iranian forces could rapidly worsen the crisis. This is why the blockade is so fraught, because it is a powder keg in the water, and the longer it persists, the risk continues, with the United States reportedly preparing for strikes even as the deal is pursued. The strait remains a place where the war could reignite. The milestone of 100 ships is a measure of accumulated risk, a marker of how long the dangerous standoff has persisted. The danger of escalation in the strait is not hypothetical, because the war has already seen exactly the kind of incident that could spiral. During the conflict, Iran's Revolutionary Guard seized a commercial container ship in the strait, pulling a civilian vessel directly into the gravity of the war, demonstrating both the vulnerability of commercial shipping in those waters and Iran's willingness to act against it. A seizure like that is precisely the sort of event that can transform a tense standoff into an open confrontation, because it forces the other side to respond, and the response can provoke a counter-response. The cycle can escalate beyond anyone's intention. With 100 ships now caught up in the blockade, the surface area for such an incident has grown enormous, because every vessel in those contested waters is a potential flashpoint, a potential trigger, a potential spark, a seizure, a collision, a misread maneuver, an exchange of fire between blockading forces and Iranian forces, any of these could ignite a broader confrontation. And with so many ships in the danger zone, the odds of some incident occurring rise with every day the standoff persists. This is part of why the trapped ships are not merely an economic and humanitarian concern, but a strategic danger, because they are the kindling in a volatile situation. And the longer they remain trapped, the risk persists that one becomes the spark. The 100-ship milestone is, in this sense, also 100 potential flashpoints, 100 opportunities for an incident to shatter the fragile deal. And this danger is heightened by the fact that the United States has reportedly been preparing for the possibility of strikes even as the deal is pursued, which means the Strait remains a place where the war could reignite at any moment. If the deal collapses and the strikes come, the trapped ships would find themselves caught in the middle of renewed warfare, in the most dangerous waters on Earth, with hostile forces exchanging fire around them. The crews on those vessels are living with that possibility every day, the knowledge that the fragile calm could shatter. This is the precariousness that the 100-ship milestone masks behind its statistical simplicity. The reality that each of those ships is sitting in a powder keg, that the standoff is not stable but volatile. The trapped ships are not waiting safely for the diplomats to sort things out. They are waiting in a war zone where violence could resume. Let me widen the lens to the broader human cost of this war, because the trapped ships are one part of a much larger tragedy. In Lebanon, the violence has been staggering, with reporting indicating that strikes have killed thousands and displaced enormous numbers from their homes. Across the wider region, the war has sent missiles across borders, disrupted the lives of millions, and spread suffering far beyond the combatants. The trapped ships, the seafarers, the global poor hit by rising prices, are all part of this larger web of suffering. When we focus on the 100 ships, we are looking at one visible thread of a vast tapestry of harm. The 100 ships are a symbol, a measure, a concrete marker, but behind them lies the full weight of a war's suffering. It is worth reflecting, too, on what blockades represent in the long history of warfare. The blockade is one of humanity's oldest instruments of coercion, a way of bending an enemy by strangling its lifelines. And blockades have always carried a moral weight because their pressure falls on the ordinary people, the civilians, the workers. Throughout history, blockades and sieges have inflicted some of the cruelest suffering because they make the suffering of the innocent into a tool. The blockade of the Strait of Hormuz is a modern version of this ancient cruelty, a strangulation of a global artery. There is something sobering in recognizing that, for all the sophistication of modern weapons, we have returned to one of the bluntest instruments of war. The 100 ships are caught in that ancient logic, a reminder that beneath the modern language of deals, this is still, at bottom, a war. And there is a deeper question worth sitting with about whether a blockade that inflicts such broad suffering can ever be justified. Those who impose blockades argue that they are a less bloody alternative to direct warfare, that strangling an economy is more humane than bombing a city. The 100 trapped ships are caught in exactly this moral ambiguity, instruments and victims of a weapon whose justification is genuinely contested. Whatever one concludes about the rights and wrongs of it, the human reality remains. The seafarers waiting on the trapped vessels. The blockade is a weapon, and like all weapons, it inflicts suffering, a grim marker of how much pain has been inflicted. So what does the milestone of 100 ships actually mean? It means the conflict, despite the peace deal, remains unresolved. The true test lies not in announcements, but in the lifting of the blockade and the freeing of the ships. The first scenario is that the wobbling deal stabilizes, the blockade lifts, and the trapped ships finally begin to move. The second scenario is that the deal collapses, the blockade tightens, and the contradiction hardens into open rupture. The third scenario is a frozen standoff, a limbo in which the milestones keep accumulating, 100 ships becoming 200. Watch the Strait, above all. Watch whether the blockade begins to lift, because that will signal that the deal is real. Watch for any incident at sea, because such an event could rapidly escalate the crisis and shatter the fragile deal. The value of focusing on something concrete is that it anchors the analysis in reality. The ships are either moving or they are not. Until the ships move, the Strait is not reopened, and the 100 vessels are the concrete evidence that the work is not yet done. They will move when the deal truly holds, and not a moment before. Watch the water, because the water will tell the truth.